What if I told you that suppressing your emotions could actually make you sick, even lead to life-threatening diseases? This isn't just a theory, it's backed by science. And the shocking part, women are at the highest risk. Dr. Gabor Maté reveals how centuries of female suppression are literally imprinted on the body, and the truth will change how you see stress, trauma, and health forever. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear could save lives.
If you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or like the wounds from your past still hold you back, you're not alone. This space is for you. Here, we heal, we grow, and we rediscover who we truly are. Beyond the pain, beyond the past. And if you're ready to step into your healing journey and finally embrace your authentic self, hit that subscribe button. Because your inner child matters, and together, we can rewrite your story. And before we dive in, I want you to affirm this. Drop "I am healing" in the comments. Let's remind ourselves, and each other.
Situation of women, for example. Now, women have 80% of autoimmune disease. Women have double the risk of PTSD. They're much more likely to take antidepressant medications than men. Now, is that an individual pathology on the part of half the population? Or is it a manifestation of the sensual suppression of the feminine and the subjugation of the feminine to the masculine under conditions of patriarchy? And what you find with autoimmune disease, it has a lot to do with self-suppression. So very often, the woman gets autoimmune disease because this society expects women to suppress their own healthy anger. And like under COVID, for example, there was a study in the States that showed that women took on the stresses of their families and their husbands, and they felt guilty that they couldn't ease the stresses of their families. Now, there was another study in Canada that showed that after open heart surgery, men recover better than women do. Then they looked at what happens. What happens is that after a man has open heart surgery, he goes home and gets taken care of by his wife. After a woman has open heart surgery, she goes back and becomes the caretaker again. So this automatic suppression of the feminine, or the enrollment of the feminine culturally in the service of what we think is the masculine, is a source of pathology in women. But that has to do with centuries old, thousands of years old, suppression of the feminine. So this shows up in a very practical sense in both the physiology and in the mental condition of half the population. It's collective. It goes back to the burning of witches. It goes back to the rape. It goes back to the collective traumatization of a gender-based traumatization of a certain part of the population. So in the Western world, we tend to individualize this and pathologize it. You know, there was a study, Thomas, that showed that women with symptoms of PTSD have double the risk of ovarian cancer, showing the unity of mind and body. But that stressing of women isn't just an individual. By the way, I'm not arguing that men are not stressed. I'm just talking about a certain dynamic here. We're talking about long-term collective, hundreds of years of trauma and cultural programming. Now, when that intersects with race, for example, then you get the situation where Black or colored or non-Caucasian women have multiple the risk of autoimmune disease, even higher than Caucasian women. And in Canada, an Indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis than that of a non-Indigenous non-woman.
Here's some newspaper clippings that illustrate who gets sick. And again, I found that whoever developed illness, whether it's cancer or multiple sclerosis or any of these illnesses, it wasn't incidental. Certain people were disease prone. And in 7 years of palliative care work, looking after terminally ill people dying of cancer, I saw the same thing over and over again. So what were the characteristics of these people? How did they stress themselves without knowing it? So the first, these are newspaper clippings from the Globe and Mail. And this is a story written by a woman who's diagnosed with breast cancer. Her name is Donna. Her doctor's name is Harold, and she's married to a guy called Hai. And Hai's first wife died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And so she goes to the doctor, and she writes in this article, Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die here, he assures me, but I'm worried about Hai. I wanted the strength to support him, I say. What do you notice about that? Some of you that weren't there last night, what do you notice about that statement? Yeah, her immediate thought is on her husband. So her automatic compulsive thought is not, my God, I'm diagnosed with cancer. How will I cope with it? What kind of support do I need? But the automatic thought is, how will I support my husband? The poor guy has already lost his first wife to breast cancer, and I'm diagnosed with it. How will I support him? All the time that I'm receiving chemotherapy and radiation or surgery, how will I support my husband emotionally? So this automatic and compulsive concern for the needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for illness and stress and burnout, for reasons that I will tell you. These are stories of people who died. And what you will notice in those obituaries is that the things that are considered to be so wonderful about these people are also the things that killed them. So I want you to consider that one. If you were diagnosed, or if a friend of yours was diagnosed with cancer, is that what you would say? Is that the thing to do is to go back to work and to keep working every day? And all the time that I'm receiving treatment, or you're receiving treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, whatever is needed, you might be sick and all that, just keep working. And keep working till you die. So this compulsion to identify with the work that you do, with the duties that you have, with the responsibilities that you've taken on, rather than the needs of the self, rather than your own needs. That's a big risk factor for illness. It's a big risk factor for burnout, for self-imposed trauma. So this inability to express your feelings, the so-called negative feelings, is a major risk factor for illness. So as I mentioned last night, there was a study in the States a few years ago that looked at 1,700 women, and over a 10-year period, and women over a 10-year period who were unhappily married and didn't express their emotions were 4 times as likely to die as those women who were unhappily married and did express their emotions. The difference wasn't whether they were happy or not. The difference was, did they actually talk about how they felt? Did they express their anger or their hurt? And the ones who didn't were 4 times as likely to die. So the suppression of how you feel is a major risk factor for illness. Here's a woman who died of cancer at age 55. This is in Calgary. She worked for the Calgary Symphony Orchestra. She was a mother of 3. A master at multitasking, she juggled several hockey practices. And I want you to look at your life, okay? A master at multitasking, she juggled several hockey practices, school board, orchestra, and other extracurricular activities. June 2005 brought terrible news to this mother of 3, by now president of the Parents' Council at Western Canada College. Emergency surgery revealed metastatic cancer. She refused the cloak of illness. She did not give up any of her roles. Now get that one. She did not give up any of her roles. It's all about roles. She even continued her 5 a.m. bicycle trips around the nearby reservoir. She enrolled in a life coaching course, and upon graduation from the Adler School, she initiated Living Out Loud, a group of women with cancer. All the time that she was having terminal illness. She did not stop for a second. So again, this compulsion to keep working and working and working, even in her spare time, is a major killer. So this business of living out to expectations and never disappointing anybody is a killer. In palliative care, I once was looking after a guy who was the president of a shark cartilage company. You may have heard about shark cartilage. It used to be marketed, maybe still is, as a prevention for cancer. So this guy sold shark cartilage. And then he gets diagnosed with cancer. Terminal cancer. And he was still eating the shark cartilage. Now, if you've ever been near this stuff, it smells awful. The stench, you could sense it as soon as you walked in the hall. So I asked him, what does that stuff taste like? He said, it's horrible, I hate it. I said, why do you eat it? He said, well, this is a week before he died. He said, well, I no longer believe that it's going to stop my cancer, but my business partner would be so disappointed if I did. My contention is very simple. What characterizes all these people is they don't know how to say no to all these responsibilities that they've taken on. They don't know how to say no. And my contention is, when you don't know how to say no, your body will say it for you. And it'll say it for you in the form of illness or some kind of a symptom. But what happens is that when you go to the doctor with a rash or an asthmatic cough or an inflammation, they're going to give you the stress hormone cortisol to treat it. But nobody's going to ask you about the stresses that you have in your life. That conversation doesn't come up. So if you have an inflammation of your joints, rheumatoid arthritis, you go to the doctor and they'll give you anti-inflammatories, but they're not going to ask you, what is your body saying no to? And you're not going to ask yourself either, because you don't think of it. And yet that's the most important question. What am I not saying no to? Let me give you an example in terms of rheumatoid arthritis. In rheumatoid arthritis, what happens is that it's called a so-called autoimmune disease. Autoimmune means self. So in the autoimmune diseases, the immune system, which is designed to protect you, actually turns against you. So in autoimmune illness, the immune system, which is meant to be your self-preservation mechanism, becomes your enemy. So the immune system attacks you so that you make antibodies against yourself. Antibodies are cells that protect you and attack bacteria and attack toxins so that you're safe. But in this case, they attack you. So in rheumatoid arthritis, there's something called rheumatoid factor, which is an antibody that attacks the joints. It's like as if the Canadian Army invaded Canada. It'd be like that. The army that's meant to protect you actually turns against you. Let me read you a quote here by a spiritual teacher. He says, your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard. They're actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed specifically for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. A part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You're not going to get the right direction unless there's something pricking you in the side telling you, look here, this way. The part of you that loves you so much that doesn't want you to lose the chance, it will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It will make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That's its purpose. A British cellist, her name was Jacqueline du Pré. You know something about her? Yeah. Jacqueline du Pré was a virtuoso and a child prodigy. So, when she played in Toronto here, she's British, but she was an international star. When she played here in Toronto when she was 21 years old, people actually cried at her performance. They cried at her performance because her music was so emotional. She wasn't a typical sedate classical musician, no. When she played, her whole body was into the music. She swayed, her long blonde hair flew in the air, and she poured all her emotions into her music. In fact, they talk about her cello voice, where she expressed all her emotions through her cello, but not in her real life. In her real life, she did not express emotions at all. She suppressed herself. She ended up with multiple sclerosis. By the time she was 27, she couldn't play anymore because she couldn't hold the bow anymore. So her career was very short. And you know what? She never wanted to become a virtuoso. She said, I don't want to become a cello virtuoso, she said, because it would kill me. She knew it. And it did kill her. But she said, I can't give it up because so many people will be so disappointed if I did. And that's why she continued. When she was 7 or 8, she said to her sister Hillary, who also became a musician, not as great as Jackie was. Hill, she says, don't tell our mommy this, but when I grow up, I won't be able to move or walk. That's what happened. She became paralyzed with multiple sclerosis. She was 7 or 8. She said, don't tell our mommy this, but when I grow up, I won't be able to move it. Now, what do you notice about that? If you were 7 or 8 years old, or let me put it this way. If you had a child that was 7 or 8, and they were afraid that they won't, when they grow up, they'll be paralyzed, who would you want them to talk to about that? If you were the parent, you want them to talk to you. But by age 7 or 8, she knew that she had to protect her mother. She was a virtuoso, a prodigy, so she went to Russia, the land of classical music, to further her education. She was raped there. When she came back to Canada, or to Britain, she said to her sister, Hill, don't tell our mommy this, but I was raped in Russia. Now why? It's because when she was born, still in the maternity hospital with her mother's father died. And her mother, who was a very troubled person herself, very close to her father, was totally grief-stricken. And guess what role the baby was given? What's that? To cheer her up, to be the mother's emotional support. So Jackie never was allowed to be her own person. She had to be like an extension of the mother. Her job was to support the mother emotionally. So they had this symbiotic relationship. And that's why she was always protecting her and not disappointing her. The story of Gabor Maté, I talk about it in the second chapter of this book, When the Body Says No. And let me read you this paragraph here. 20 years after her childhood debut, now ill with multiple sclerosis, Jackie told a friend what she had felt on first finding herself on stage. Quote, it was as if until that moment she had in front of her a brick wall which blocked her communication with the outside world. But the moment Jackie started to play for an audience, the brick wall vanished and she felt able to speak at last. It was a sensation that never left her when she performed. So the only time she could express herself was when she was on stage. In every other way she suppressed herself. In her marriage, in her relationships with her parents, she suppressed herself. Her sister said she was always the Jackie that circumstances demanded. So she was not herself. She was not authentic. It was always about the attachment. A composer called Edward Elgar. Elgar was in his 60s when he wrote this, and this happened during the First World War. And the First World War was a time of terrible disillusionment, terrible carnage, terrible trauma. Tens of thousands of young people being killed every day in France in those terrible trench battles. And Elgar, the composer, was completely despondent. And he said, everything good and nice and clean and fresh and sweet is far away, never to return. He wrote that in 1917, when he wrote the concerto. He was in his 7th decade, in the twilight of his years. And her sister writes, Jackie's sister writes in her biography of her sister, Jackie's ability to portray the emotions of a man in the autumn of his life was one of her extraordinary and inexplicable capacities. Well, my comment is, extraordinary, yes, but it's not inexplicable. Because by the time she was in her 20s, by the time she recorded this piece when she was 20 years old, Jackie was already in the twilight of her life. Within a few years, she wouldn't be able to play the cello anymore. And by the time she was in her early 40s, she would die of multiple sclerosis. And she knew that. Something inside her knew that already. She understood Elgar because she had partaken of the same suffering. His portrait always disturbed her. He had a miserable life hill, she told her sibling, and he was ill, yet throughout it all, he had a radiant soul, and that's what I feel in his music. Now, who do you think she was talking about? She was talking about herself, but she didn't recognize that. After she died, her sister listened to a performance of the same concerto on the BBC. It had been Jackie's final performance, public performance in Britain. A few moments of tuning, the sister writes, a short pause, and she began. I suddenly jumped. She was slowing the tempo down. A few more bars, and it became vividly clear. I knew exactly what was happening. Jackie, as always, was speaking for her cello. I could hear what she was saying. I could almost see tears on her face. She was saying goodbye to herself, playing her own requiem. So then the question then is, how do these traits of suppressing emotions, not saying no, taking on responsibility for everybody else, not expressing your own needs, how do they lead to illness? Well, they lead to illness and burnout because physically they affect the body. They affect the body because it's now known that the mind and body can't be separated. So Western medicine, which has got great achievements, obviously, in many, many ways, miraculous in some ways, however, still falls into the deep error of separating the mind from the body. So when you, as I said earlier, when you go to the doctor with a rash, nobody's going to ask you about your life. And yet that rash says everything about your childhood and everything about how you live your life right now. When you go to the doctor with inflammation, of your joints, they're not going to ask you about your relationships, about your work, about what you take on, because we separate the mind from the body.
The connection between our emotions and our health is undeniable. What we suppress, our bodies express, sometimes in ways we never expected. The truth is, healing starts when we begin to listen to ourselves, honor our emotions, and break free from patterns that no longer serve us. You are not alone in this journey.
Healing takes time, and you don't have to do it alone. If this message resonated with you, know that your journey matters. Be gentle with yourself, keep exploring, and surround yourself with support. If you haven't yet, subscribe and join this community. We're in this together. And before you go, comment, I am healing, to affirm your growth. You are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone.